The Neanderthal problem is one of the longest-running debates in paleoanthropology, unresolved for more than 150 years. The traditional story claims that Neanderthals were a separate species, a side branch of human evolution, biologically distinct who only occasionally interbred with modern humans during rare moments of contact. But when the evidence is actually placed on the table, genetics, reproduction, physiology, and the inconvenient way fossils refuse to stay inside neat categories, that story begins to look less like a scientific conclusion and more like a preference, or worse, a theoretical need to keep them separate, because the more we learn, the more the boundary dissolves. Neanderthals were not almost human, they were human. Not just in a sentimental or cultural sense, but in the hard biological sense. They carried mitochondrial DNA that sits comfortably within the human lineage. They carried Y chromosome DNA that followed the same structural logic seen in modern humans. They shared blood group systems, meaning the same immunological foundations existed on both sides. They produced fertile offspring with Homo sapiens, not once, not rarely, but repeatedly across vast spans of geography and time. Their DNA is not an accident in our genomes, it is a persistent layer inside the bodies of billions of living people. At some point, an honest question has to be asked. If all of this is true, what exactly are we claiming when we call Neanderthals a different species? Species is not a sacred word, it is a tool, one meant to describe reality, and when a tool fails, it should be replaced, not defended. The separation between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was never as clean as textbooks wanted it to be. It was always an overlapping population system, different regional expressions of a broader human metapopulation, diverging through periods of isolation and then repeatedly reconnecting through gene flow. Neanderthals were not the Martians of Ice Age Europe. They were a Western Eurasian human population with a distinctive anatomical package shaped by climate, drift, and long local continuity. When Homo sapiens expanded into these regions, what occurred was not the meeting of two biologically incompatible species, like horses and donkeys. It was the meeting of two human populations, different but compatible enough that interbreeding was not an exception, it was part of the story. And here is the point that detonates the entire separate species narrative. If you transported early Homo sapiens from 100,000 years ago into a modern anatomy classroom, they would not look like modern Europeans. They would look archaic, they would look heavy-boned, they would look Neanderthal-like. Yet we still call them Homo sapiens, not some separate species. We already accept that human anatomy can vary dramatically across time while remaining within the same species. We accept this because it is convenient to do so for fossils we emotionally want inside the modern category. But when it comes to Neanderthals, the rules suddenly change. The same anatomical range tolerated within Homo sapiens becomes proof of separateness for Neanderthals. That inconsistency is not biological, it is narrative. This is why claims by some paleoanthropologists, such as defining Homo sapiens by a high, rounded globular brain case and a relatively narrow pelvis, become deeply misleading when used as hard boundaries. Those traits may describe tendencies in living humans, but they collapse as diagnostic rules the moment fossil humans enter the discussion. Globularity is not a magical stamp dividing humanity into clean species boxes. It is a trend that intensified over time and varies widely across human fossils. Many early Homo sapiens lack the hyperglobular vault of recent humans, while some fossils labeled modern show mixed profiles, modern in some regions, archaic in others. Neanderthals themselves show variation, and the picture becomes even messier in contact zones like the Levant, where Neanderthal and sapiens traits interpenetrate. Using a single cranial descriptor as a species boundary is not science, it is rhetoric. Consider a mood 1. If we are honest, this fossil alone makes the tidy narrative sweat. Ahmoud 1 is classified as a Neanderthal, yet he defies the caricature of a squat, brutish, biologically alien creature. He had a cranial capacity larger than the modern human average. He was tall and relatively gracile, while still possessing some classic Neanderthal traits. And Ahmoud 1 is not unique. The entire Levantine corridor reads like a gradient, not a fence. A contact zone of overlapping populations rather than two sealed species. That is exactly what you expect when populations diverge locally but never fully lose contact and then repeatedly reconnect. Species boundaries do not behave like that unless a classification scheme is being forced onto a reality that refuses to comply. Neanderthals do not look like an extinct species that evolved in total reproductive isolation. They look like a population with local specialization, cold-adapted body proportions, robust bones, and distinctive facial architecture within a wider human framework. Even their classic traits, mid-facial projection, broad noses, robust skeletons, can be shaped by environment as much as ancestry. Pelvic width is often cited as a sapiens marker, but pelvic anatomy varies substantially, even today, across populations and sexes, influenced by body size, locomotion, obstetrics, and climate. Fossil humans across 300,000 years show even more variance. Turning pelvis shape into a species barcode is not biologically serious. The same applies to globularity. Modern human cranial form is the endpoint of a long evolutionary smoothing process, not an ancient identity badge. Modern anatomy is not a fixed template, it is a moving target through time. Early Homo sapiens were not fully modern. That is why the phrase early modern exists at all. It is an admission of transition. But once you allow transition within Homo sapiens, you have already dismantled the strongest argument for excluding Neanderthals. Because if archaic sapiens can still be sapiens, then Neanderthals can be as well. Genetics makes this even harder to deny. Neanderthal ancestry in living humans is not trivial. It reflects repeated, fertile hybridization events whose descendants survived and spread. In truly distinct mammalian species, hybrids are often sterile or severely disadvantaged. Neanderthal genes persist because many were neutral or beneficial. Some were selected against, exactly what happens when populations merge. That is population genetics, not speciation. Blood groups matter here more than is often acknowledged. Neanderthals carried recognizably human variants, indicating shared immune systems and physiological compatibility. These systems evolve under strong selection. Their continuity undermines the idea of Neanderthals as a separate biological category. Which brings us to culture and the attempt to exclude it. Some anthropologists argue that behaviors such as burials, art, and symbolic practices should be excluded from species classification because behavior is plastic and spreads easily. On the surface, this sounds cautious. In reality, it is strategic. It removes the strongest evidence of Neanderthal humanity by redefining the rules. Because we already use culture to define Homo sapiens in practice, constantly. Behavioral modernity, symbolic expression, long-distance exchange, ornamentation, ritual, and identity matters enormously when bones are absent. Culture is treated as essential when identifying modern humans, but dismissed when Neanderthals exhibit it. That is not rigor, that is boundary maintenance. Culture is not a cosmetic add-on in humans, it is a biological system. Our brains evolved for it. Our childhoods evolved for it. Our anatomy evolved for language, social learning, ritual, and identity. To pretend culture is irrelevant to human biology is biologically absurd. Neanderthals had complex tool traditions lasting tens of thousands of years. They shared industries with Homo sapiens. They used pigments, ornaments, feathers, fire, shelters, clothing. They exploited diverse environments, from forests and lakesides to coasts and open plains. They hunted birds, gathered shellfish, ate plants, used medicinal knowledge, cared for the injured, and buried the dead. These are not accidental behaviors. They reflect social structure, cognition, and tradition. If culture counts for Homo sapiens, it must count for Neanderthals too. The deeper truth is this: Neanderthals were not a frozen type. They were not a static species isolated for 300,000 years. They were a dynamic population system interacting with other humans. The genetic record increasingly shows gene flow in multiple directions between Neanderthals, sapiens, and other archaic groups. That is exactly what you expect when human populations coexist across Eurasia for long periods: divergence, reconnection, divergence again. Species labels become blunt instruments in that reality. Neanderthals were different, but difference does not equal species. Their distinctive anatomy reflects population-level adaptation, not biological incompatibility. Hybrid zones blur traits. Shared ancestry blurs traits. Evolutionary gradients blur traits. The claim that Neanderthals were a separate species who occasionally interbred collapses under its own contradictions. Repeated fertile interbreeding, shared physiological systems, genetic continuity, and overlapping anatomy all point to the same conclusion: these were not two separate biological worlds. And when we admit that early Homo sapiens were themselves more archaic and more Neanderthal-like than living humans, the modernity-based species boundary becomes indefensible. The argument was never purely biological. It was always about who gets to be called human. The evidence is forcing a re-evaluation. Neanderthals were not close relatives in a poetic sense. They were part of humanity in a literal one. Their genes live on. Their adaptations shaped later populations. Their culture overlaps with ours. Their anatomy overlaps with ours. The boundary between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is not a species boundary. It is a population boundary shaped by time, climate, and geography. And once that is accepted, the story flips. Neanderthals stop being the other. They become what they always were: a human population we met, merged with, and absorbed as part of our expansion across the world. The real problem is not that the evidence points in this direction. The problem is that for decades, paleoanthropology resisted saying it because it undermines the clean replacement story. But reality doesn't care about clean stories. Neanderthals were not a separate species that brushed against humanity. They were part of it, an overlapping branch of the same long, braided evolutionary stream. Thanks for watching.